The snow fell softly on Riverside Park that December evening, each flake catching the glow of the Christmas lights strung along the pathway. Margaret Chin sat alone on a wooden bench, her tailored camel coat wrapped tight against the cold. Her honey blonde hair was styled in an elegant updo, but her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the tears streaming down her face. At 42, Margaret had built an empire. 300 employees looked to her for direction. Magazines featured her success story, but tonight, none of that mattered tonight. She was just a daughter who had lost her father 2 weeks before Christmas. The decorated tree behind her sparkled with golden ornaments and red ribbons. Families passed by, their laughter echoing through the winter air. Margaret watched them, feeling the sharp edge of loneliness cut deeper with each happy voice. She didn't notice the little girl approaching until a small mittened hand touched her arm. "Don't cry, miss." Margaret looked down through blurred vision. A child stood before her, maybe 4 years old, wearing a pink puffy jacket and a white knitted hat with barriers. Her round cheeks were pink from the cold, and her blue eyes held genuine concern. "Sweetheart, I'm all right," Margaret managed, wiping her face quickly. The little girl tilted her head, studying Margaret with the serious expression only children can master. "You don't look all right. My mommy says it's okay to cry, but you look very sad." Margaret felt her composure crumbling again. She nodded, unable to speak. The child reached into her pocket and pulled out a small wooden toy, a hand-carved reindeer. "You can hold Rudy if you want. He makes me feel better when I'm sad." The gesture broke something open in Margaret's chest. She accepted the toy with trembling hands. "Thank you, that's very kind." "I'm Sophie," the girl announced, then pointed back toward a man approaching them. "That's my daddy. He's really good at making people feel better." The man wore a black wool coat over a white shirt. His dark hair was slightly tousled by the wind, and concern filled his brown eyes as he hurried toward them. "Sophie, you can't just run off like that," he said gently, then noticed Margaret's tear-stained face. His expression shifted to understanding. "I'm sorry, is she bothering you?" "No," Margaret said quickly, "she's wonderful actually. She just showed me more kindness than I've felt in weeks." The man knelt beside his daughter, speaking softly. "Sophie, what did we talk about? Giving people space?" Sophie looked between her father and Margaret, then back at her father with determination. "But Daddy, she's crying, miss. You can borrow my dad. He's really good at fixing sad." Despite everything, Margaret laughed. It came out watery and broken, but it was genuine. The man looked embarrassed but smiled. "I'm Daniel," he said, extending his hand, "and my daughter apparently thinks I'm available for rent." "Margaret," she shook his hand, surprised by the warmth in his grip, "and I think your daughter might be wiser than both of us." Daniel sat down on the bench, keeping a respectful distance. Sophie climbed up between them, swinging her legs. "We come here every Friday," Sophie announced. "Daddy says the lights remind us that even dark times have brightness." Margaret looked at Daniel, seeing a depth of experience in his eyes. "That's beautiful." "My wife passed away 2 years ago," Daniel said quietly. "Cancer." Sophie was only 2. She doesn't remember much, but we come here because Caroline loved Christmas. The words hung in the cold air. Margaret understood then why this child recognized grief when she saw it. "My father died 2 weeks ago," Margaret heard herself say. "Heart attack. He was 68. I thought we'd have more time. I thought." Her voice broke. Sophie reached over and patted Margaret's hand. "It's okay to miss people. Daddy says the people we love never really leave us. They live in here." She pressed her small hand against Margaret's coat, right over her heart. Margaret covered Sophie's hand with her own, tears flowing freely now. "You're right, sweetheart, you're absolutely right." Daniel pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to Margaret. She accepted it gratefully. "I'm supposed to be strong," Margaret said. "I run a company. Hundreds of people depend on me, but sitting in my office, looking at the empty chair where my father used to sit when he visited, I couldn't do it anymore. I just walked out." "Strength isn't pretending you don't hurt," Daniel said. "I learned that the hard way after Caroline died. I tried to be strong for Sophie. I held everything in until one day I broke down in a grocery store. A stranger sat with me for an hour, just listening. Sometimes we need permission to fall apart." Sophie leaned against Margaret's arm. "Daddy cries sometimes. I hear him at night, but then he wakes up and makes me pancakes and we're okay." The honesty in the child's voice moved Margaret deeply. She looked at this little family, seeing their resilience and their pain intertwined. "How do you do it?" Margaret asked. "How do you keep going?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, watching the snow fall. "One day at a time. Some days, 1 hour at a time. I focus on Sophie. I focus on the small joys. A good cup of coffee, Sophie's laugh, nights like this when the world feels peaceful. And I talk to Caroline. I tell her about our daughter, about my day. I think she hears me." "Do you work?" Margaret asked. "I'm a teacher," Daniel said. "High school literature. It doesn't pay much, but it lets me be there for Sophie. Afternoons, evenings, weekends. What we lost in income, we gained in time together." Margaret thought about her own life. The endless meetings, the business dinners, the weekends in the office. She'd built her success partly to make her father proud. He'd started the company from nothing, and she'd expanded it beyond his dreams, but in doing so, had she missed what truly mattered? My father used to tell me to slow down, she said. He'd say money comes and goes, but moments don't. I never listened. I thought there would be time. Sophie tugged on Margaret's sleeve. Do you have pictures of your daddy? Margaret pulled out her phone, scrolling to a recent photo. Her father stood in front of the company building, gray-haired and distinguished, pride shining in his eyes. She showed it to Sophie. He looks nice, Sophie said simply, like he gave good hugs. The best hugs, Margaret whispered. They sat together as the evening deepened around them. The park continued its rhythm. Couples strolled by, children played in the snow, the Christmas tree glowed steadily. Daniel began to speak, his voice measured and thoughtful. After Caroline died, a grief counselor told me something I think about often. She said grief is love with nowhere to go. All that love we had for the person, it doesn't disappear when they die, it just needs a new direction. What did you do with yours? Margaret asked. I put it into Sophie, Daniel said, ruffling his daughter's hat. I put it into my students. I put it into living the kind of life Caroline would want me to live, not moving on, but moving forward with her memory beside me. Margaret nodded slowly. My father wanted me to find balance. He used to joke that I'd work myself into an early grave. Now he's gone, and I'm realizing he was right. What was I working so hard for? To prove myself. To him? To the world. Maybe, Daniel said gently, or maybe you were running from something. Only you can answer that, but I can tell you this, it's never too late to change course. Sophie yawned, leaning heavily against Margaret. I'm sleepy, Daddy. I know, Pumpkin, we should head home. Daniel stood, scooping Sophie into his arms. The child's head dropped onto his shoulder immediately. Margaret stood too, reluctant for the evening to end. Thank you both of you. You have no idea what this meant to me. Daniel shifted Sophie's weight, then reached into his pocket with one hand. I'm going to do something forward, and you can say no. My number if you ever need someone to talk to, someone who understands. Margaret took the offered card. I'd like that very much. We're here most Friday evenings, Daniel said, weather permitting, if you ever want company. Margaret watched them walk away. Daniel's tall figure bent protectively over his small daughter. Something had shifted in her heart. The crushing loneliness had eased, replaced by a different feeling, hope, maybe, or possibility. She looked down at the wooden reindeer still in her hand. Sophie had forgotten it. She smiled and tucked it carefully into her pocket. That night, back in her apartment, Margaret didn't retreat to her home office like usual. Instead, she made tea and sat by the window, watching the snow. She thought about her father, about Daniel's words, about Sophie's innocent wisdom. Over the following weeks, Margaret returned to the park every Friday. She and Daniel talked for hours while Sophie played. Sophie would periodically run back to check on them, bringing treasures, pine cones, interesting leaves, once a very confused beetle. Margaret learned about Daniel's life as a widower, his struggles and small victories. Daniel learned about Margaret's business, her relationship with her father, her fears about the future. They shared stories, memories, comfortable silences. On Christmas Eve, Margaret made a decision. She called her executive team. I'm stepping back, she announced, promoting from within. I'll stay on as chairman, but someone else can run the daily operations. I need to live, not just work. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, approval and relief in equal measure. That evening, she found Daniel and Sophie at the park. They brought cookies. Sophie ran to Margaret immediately, throwing her arms around her legs. You came. We thought maybe you wouldn't. I wouldn't miss it, Margaret said, meaning it. She handed Sophie a wrapped box. For you, early Christmas present. Sophie tore it open to reveal a beautiful wooden dollhouse, handcrafted with intricate details. Her eyes went wide. It's perfect. I thought Rudy might like a home, Margaret said, pulling the little reindeer from her pocket. I've been keeping him safe. Daniel's eyes were suspiciously bright. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, Margaret said simply. They walked through the park together, the three of them. The Christmas lights reflected off the snow, casting everything in a warm glow. Sophie walked between them, holding both their hands. This is my favorite Christmas, she announced, because we're all together. Margaret squeezed the small hand in hers, looking over Sophie's head to meet Daniel's gaze. Something passed between them, understanding, possibility, hope. Life, Margaret realized, had a way of bringing people together when they needed it most. A grieving daughter, a widowed father, a child who understood more about love and loss than anyone her age should. They'd found each other in pain and created something new. Not a replacement for what they'd lost. Nothing could do that, but a new chapter, written with care and growing affection. As they stood beneath the glowing Christmas tree, Margaret felt her father's presence not as an absence, but as a blessing. He would have liked Daniel. She thought he would have loved Sophie, and he would have been proud that Margaret had finally learned to slow down, to see what mattered. The snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the world in quiet grace. Margaret tilted her face up to it, feeling truly peaceful for the first time in months. Thank you, she whispered to the sky, to her father, to fate, to the universe that had sent a little girl in a pink jacket to teach her about healing. Sophie tugged her hand. What did you say? Margaret knelt down, bringing herself to Sophie's level. I said thank you for letting me borrow your dad, for sharing your Fridays, for showing me that sad people can become happy again. Sophie hugged her tight. You don't have to borrow him anymore, you can keep him, we can share. Over Sophie's shoulder, Margaret met Daniel's eyes again. He smiled, and she smiled back, and in that moment, everything felt possible. The future was unwritten, but for the first time since loss had entered her world, Margaret was ready to write it slowly, carefully, with these two people who'd shown her that love doesn't end, it just transforms into something new.